The convent stood on the edge of an endless Illinois cornfield, its stone walls gray against the flat horizon. Built in 1871, it was meant as a refuge, a place where silence was not a punishment, but a form of devotion. By 1919, though, the silence had begun to take on another shape, one that pressed against the lungs of anyone who stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of iron. Some claimed it was just the soil, rich with minerals. Others whispered that the earth itself remembered things it should not. The first accounts came not from the sisters, but from visitors. A traveling priest reported droplets like rust-colored tears sliding down the stone near the chapel's inner door. At first he thought it was condensation, moisture pulled from the warm breath of prayer against cold walls. But when he touched it, the stain clung to his fingers with a thickness too dark to ignore. He washed his hands 3 times before the color faded. He never returned. By the end of summer, the stories spread beyond the church. Farmers arriving with donations described the convent as weeping. Their wives crossed themselves before entering, murmuring that it was not water but blood seeping from the stones. The sisters, however, said little. They bowed their heads lower during services, their lips moving faster over familiar prayers. To the outside eye, they were not merely pious, they were afraid. The man who would later record these events in obsessive detail was Dr. Walter Greaves, a physician from Springfield who had grown fascinated by unexplainable phenomena. He was not a believer in spirits nor an enemy of the church, but he had a tendency to linger where boundaries between the rational and the unthinkable began to blur. He arrived one late autumn evening, finding the convent shrouded in fog that clung to his coat and dulled the sound of his steps. His notes describe the silence as unnatural, not of peace, but of something waiting. Inside, he saw it himself, a line of liquid trailing down the stone near the altar, thick and red. He pressed his handkerchief to it, lifted the cloth, and stared as the fibers absorbed the stain. Later, he tried to test it, expecting paint or some trick of mineral seepage. Yet under the lantern, the color spread like diluted blood, and its scent was metallic, undeniable. The sisters offered no explanation. They spoke politely, but their eyes carried shadows as if something heavy had been buried within them. Dr. Greaves wrote that one of them, a young novice named Clara, refused to enter the chapel alone after dusk. When he asked her why, she whispered, "Because it cries louder at night." What did she mean by louder? The walls did not merely bleed, they seemed to exhale, a slow, suffocating breath that left visitors unsettled. Greaves would later describe hearing faint noises within the stone itself, as though water, or something else, moved through veins no mason had ever carved. On his second night, he stayed longer, pressing his ear against the chapel wall. He thought he heard a pulse, a slow rhythmic beat, impossibly steady, as if the building itself had a heart. He pulled away quickly, shaken by the notion. The rational explanation seemed thin, almost desperate in the face of what he sensed. By the time dawn rose over the cornfields, he understood that this was not merely a curiosity for medical journals. Something here had entwined itself with the very stones, something that bled and waited. Those were the words that echoed in Dr. Greaves's notebook, circled twice as if he feared he might forget them, or worse, convince himself he had only imagined. The convent in daylight seemed calmer, the chapel washed in pale morning light, but the stain on the wall had thickened overnight. It was not water damage, not the trick of shadows. The stone was seeping still, as though the earth beneath carried a wound that would not close. The sisters carried out their routines with visible strain. Their hands moved quickly over the bread dough in the kitchen, their lips whispering prayers while their eyes flicked toward the chapel doors, as if expecting them to open on their own. One of the older nuns, Sister Agnes, avoided speaking altogether. Her face remained drawn, her eyes hollow. When Greaves approached her, She simply lifted her sleeve to reveal a small crimson spot that had soaked through the linen. She claimed it appeared each night upon waking, though her body bore no wound. The villagers' accounts grew stranger. Some swore the convent's bell rang faintly at odd hours when no one had pulled the rope. Others said their animals refused to graze near the convent walls, bleating nervously, straining against their leads. A farmer's boy insisted he saw shapes in the mist that rose around the chapel, shapes that seemed to walk the grounds, though no footsteps marked the earth. Dr. Greaves, torn between skepticism and a mounting dread, wrote that he felt the weight of something unconfessed in every glance the sisters exchanged. He pressed them gently at first, then more firmly. Why did they not leave? Why did they not seek help from the bishop or abandon the building altogether? Their answer was silence until Clara spoke again. "It is not the walls that bleed," she whispered. "It is us." Her words gnawed at him. Was this a collective delusion, an outbreak of hysteria tied to the strain of war's aftermath, influenza or isolation? Or was there something physical, mineral-rich groundwater seeping upward in a strange reaction? The physician in him clung to the latter, yet the man who had pressed his ear against the stone the night before could not so easily dismiss the other possibility, that a structure of faith might hold within it something darker than belief. I wonder even now where you are listening from, alone in the dim light of a quiet room, or perhaps outside with the world rushing by. If this voice draws you into that silence, perhaps you might leave a thought, a word, some trace that you too have felt the chill of this story. By the third evening, Greaves noted a new phenomenon. The liquid seemed to emerge not only from the chapel walls, but also from small fissures in the stone floor itself, as though the building exhaled through hidden pores. He tried collecting it in a vial. By lantern light, the substance gleamed a dark red, thickening as if clotting. His medical instincts recoiled. Yet when he tested it against water, the viscosity and color persisted in ways he could not explain. That night, Clara refused to sleep in the dormitory. She begged another sister to stay awake with her in the corridor, convinced that if she closed her eyes, she would hear the convent itself whisper her name. Dr. Greaves stayed nearby, his notebook trembling in his hand as he wrote. Just past midnight, a sound rolled through the stone like a muffled moan, and the chapel door creaked open, though no one stood near it. Dr. Greaves rose to his feet at once, his heart pounding. The air in the corridor seemed to thicken, pressing into the lungs like damp wool. Clara clutched the sleeve of his coat, her knuckles white, while the other sister whispered prayers so quickly they blurred into frantic sound. The door, ancient oak bound with iron, groaned wider as though something unseen had pushed it from within. Greaves stepped forward. His rational mind clung to explanations, drafts, weakened hinges, pressure changes in the stone. Yet the silence that followed rang too deeply for ordinary air. He approached, lantern lifted, the flame shivering though no wind stirred. The chapel interior stretched into shadows, the altar faintly visible. At the base of the wall, the liquid had spread into irregular trails that gleamed in the lantern's glow. He bent closer and froze. The substance was not pooling randomly. It seemed to have taken form. Thin rivulets wound into shapes resembling letters, crude, uneven, as if written by an unsteady hand. Greaves squinted, and though the words were fragmented, they appeared to spell fragments of Latin prayers. He staggered back, his notebook slipping from his grasp. Clara gasped, pointing at the wall. The words bled downward, the letters collapsing into stains, but their impression lingered. Not the random chaos of mineral seepage, but intention. Someone or something was leaving a message. The next day, whispers spread quickly among the villagers. A second visitor, a young carpenter called to repair a broken stair within the convent, had collapsed upon entering the chapel. He awoke, trembling, unable to speak, and when pressed, he muttered only that he had seen someone kneeling in the wall. His words traveled across town like sparks in dry grass, igniting speculation. Some insisted it was fraud, a cruel performance meant to draw attention or money. Others believed the sisters were being punished for sins unspoken. Greaves recorded all of it with growing unease. If it were hysteria, it was spreading, yet hysteria did not stain his handkerchief, nor did it explain the carpenter's terror. He found himself returning again and again to the wall, staring at the faint patterns left behind, as though answers might emerge if only he studied long enough. But each time, the unease deepened. He began to dream of walls that pulsed with veins, of cloisters echoing with sobs that did not belong to the living. By evening, the convent's atmosphere had shifted. Even the sisters' measured footsteps rang louder, as if the stones beneath them were listening. Sister Agnes, silent as ever, walked with a limp, claiming the floor burned beneath her bare feet. Clara confessed that she dreamed nightly of a figure in black robes who stood at the altar, faceless yet watching. Greaves tried to steady himself with logic, telling the sisters aloud that illness, exhaustion, and grief could create visions. But in the privacy of his journal, he admitted otherwise. "There is intention here," he wrote, "a will that seeks to be known." That night, determined to uncover the truth, he placed his lantern on the chapel floor and remained alone inside. Hours passed, the shadows shifting as the flame withered lower. Near midnight, he felt the stone beneath his palm tremble, not as if cracking, but as if something alive pressed from the other side, waiting to come through. Dr. Greaves tore his hand away from the trembling stone. His skin chilled, though the air around him remained heavy and warm. The lantern flame flickered violently, stretching shadows into monstrous shapes across the chapel walls. He stood rooted to the floor, his rational mind screaming to flee, yet his body resisting as though the building itself demanded his witness. The sound came next, a low vibration deep in the stone. More sensation than noise, like a groan forced through miles of rock. It rolled through his chest, into his bones, and for a fleeting second, he believed he heard words, syllables smothered in stone. He staggered back, clutching his journal, his pulse erratic. Had he truly heard speech, or only the desperate invention of a mind gasping for reason? When dawn arrived, the sisters found him pale, his clothes damp with sweat. Clara touched his arm and whispered, "You've heard it too." Her tone carried no question. She knew. The others avoided his eyes, but their silence was no longer the silence of obedience. It was the silence of fear bound by secrecy. Over the following days, the bleeding worsened. The trails on the walls spread wider, soaking into the mortar until some stones appeared, marbled with dark stains. The air carried a constant metallic tang, and visitors turned away at the door, refusing to cross the threshold. Livestock grew restless, pulling violently against tethers if led too near. The convent seemed to exist under quarantine, sealed not by decree, but by dread. Dr. Greaves wrote meticulously, yet the more he recorded, the less stable his conclusions became. He tested the liquid again, and again it behaved as blood would, thickening when left to sit, clotting at the edges of the vial. Still, there were anomalies. It did not dry as quickly, and its color deepened unnaturally under lamplight. He began to suspect that this was not blood from any human vein, but something altered, something belonging to the convent itself. One evening, Sister Agnes finally broke her silence. Her voice was cracked, as though unused for weeks, and her words tumbled out in fragments. "It began years ago," she said, "with small marks on the walls, stains no larger than a handprint. At first we thought them mildew, but the stains grew, and then the voices began. Not all hear them, only some, but those who do, they change. When pressed, she refused to say more, retreating into the safety of her prayers. But Clara lingered after, her wide eyes fixed on Greaves. "They told me never to speak," she confessed, "but you should know. The walls do not only bleed, they take. Sometimes at night I feel my breath stolen, as if the stones are drawing it away." Greaves could not dismiss her words. Too many patterns had emerged, too many strange consistencies for chance alone. He felt the weight of intention again, a deliberate force playing with its captives. His nights became longer, his dreams darker, filled with the sense of eyes watching from cracks in the mortar. On the sixth night, while the sisters chanted vespers, a cry tore through the chapel. One of the novices had collapsed before the altar, her skin pale, her chest still. When Greaves rushed forward, he realized she was not unconscious. Her eyes were open, fixed on the wall, her lips moving silently. The novice lay frozen, her eyes wide, her mouth shaping words no ear could capture. Dr. Greaves leaned closer, pressing his ear near her lips, straining to decipher. There was rhythm, the cadence of prayer, but the syllables were wrong, guttural, ancient. Clara, kneeling beside him, clutched the girl's hand and whispered her name, but the novice did not blink. Instead, her gaze remained locked upon the bleeding wall as though awaiting a response. The sisters pulled her away, yet Greaves felt resistance, as if some invisible tether bound her to the stone. Once carried into her chamber, her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, but she did not stir. Her lips, however, continued their ceaseless murmur. The convent felt smaller that night, the air more oppressive, each hallway echoing faint sounds of her whispering. Greaves could not help but recall Sister Agnes's words, "The walls take." Was this what she had meant? That the building itself consumed life, breath, or faith until nothing remained? He wrote furiously in his journal, trying to impose order on the madness. But as the ink spread across the page, he realized he was no longer observing patterns of hysteria or chance phenomena. These were deliberate acts, orchestrated, measured over time. The convent was not decaying at random, it was methodical. He sought evidence in the architecture. By candlelight, he inspected the chapel's foundation, tracing fissures and strange indentations. The stones bore marks inconsistent with simple wear, grooves too deliberate, patterns too symmetrical. He sketched them carefully, realizing they resembled sigils he had seen in obscure texts, shapes tied not to scripture but to rites far older, forgotten by polite faith. At supper, the sisters sat in silence, their bowls untouched. Clara finally broke the stillness. "Do you not see? It remembers us. It knows when we are weak." Her voice trembled, but her eyes burned with certainty. Agnes hushed her with a sharp glance, but the damage was done. Greaves felt the truth in her words. This was not a place merely inhabited by shadows. It was a structure of memory built on something that demanded sacrifice. The villagers, too, had begun to notice. A rumor spread that no crops thrived in fields nearest the convent, though the soil there was rich and black. Livestock miscarried, wells grew foul, and the farmers muttered that the sisters had drawn a curse upon themselves. Some whispered of tearing down the convent stone by stone, yet none dared approach after sunset. That evening, Greaves lingered near the novice's chamber. Her whispering had grown louder, carrying through the corridor like chanting. He pressed his ear against the door and froze. It was not one voice, but many. Layered tones, some high and sharp, others deep and resonant, weaving together like a choir within her throat. His notes from that night are frantic, written with a hand that shook. Not hysteria, not sleep speaking, a conversation. She speaks and something answers. The thought lodged in his chest like a stone. If the walls bled, if they whispered, if they consumed breath and voice, then this was no passive haunting. This was communication, and worse, it was growing stronger. Near midnight, the chanting ceased, replaced by silence so absolute it pressed against the ears like cotton. Then, from within the novice's room, came 3 sharp knocks against the wall. The sound reverberated through the corridor like a hammer striking a coffin lid. Dr. Greaves felt his chest tighten as though the air had been split in 2. Clara screamed softly, muffling it behind her hands, while Sister Agnes dropped to her knees, pressing her forehead against the cold stone floor. Greaves forced himself forward, flinging open the novice's chamber door, lantern trembling in his grip. The girl still lay on her bed, eyes glassy, lips barely parted, but her right hand rested against the wall, fingers twitching with each unseen beat, as though responding to something only she could hear. Greaves stepped closer, knelt, and pressed his own palm against the stone where her fingers lingered. The chill cut through his flesh like ice. And then another knock, this time from inside the wall itself. He recoiled, the lantern nearly falling from his grasp. The sisters crossed themselves in unison, whispers breaking through their vows of silence. Greaves steadied himself, then leaned closer, listening. A voice emerged, faint and indistinct, as though filtered through water. He could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone or something was answering the girl's whispers. That night he could not rest. His journal grew crowded with fevered observations, a cascade of questions. Was this a phenomenon tied to geology, resonance, shifting stone, underground rivers? Or was it what the sisters feared, a dialogue with something beyond comprehension? He scribbled a note in the margin, not accident, not hysteria, deliberate intelligence. By morning, he sought out Clara. She had grown pale, her hands trembling as she folded linens, but her eyes blazed with a strange clarity. "It wants us to listen," she said. "That's why it bleeds. That's why it speaks. It wants to be remembered." Greaves pressed her for more, yet before she could answer, Agnes stormed in, her voice trembling with rare fury. "You will damn us all with your questions. Leave it buried where it belongs." Her outburst left the convent shaken. The younger sisters avoided the chapel entirely, choosing to pray in the courtyard despite the biting autumn winds. Villagers, too, began to gather at the gates, drawn by rumors that the sisters communed with spirits. They whispered of exorcisms, of fire, of purging the place altogether. Greaves felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He could no longer frame this as a curiosity for study. It had become a crisis, social, spiritual, perhaps even physical. And yet, despite himself, he was drawn deeper. He wanted to hear it again, to understand. That evening, while others kept their distance, he returned to the novice's chamber. She lay silent now, no whispers on her lips, but the wall still pulsed faintly with a rhythm beneath the stone. Greaves placed his hand against it once more. This time, instead of knocks, he felt a drag, like fingers tracing the other side of the wall, matching his own touch. His heart thundered. He pressed harder, leaning in. A voice emerged sharper now, distinct. He could not believe it, but it spoke his name spoken from inside the stone. The sound struck Dr. Greaves with a force greater than any physical blow. His knees buckled, his breath caught. No one in the convent could have whispered it. He was certain of that. The sisters avoided even using his name in conversation, referring to him only as the doctor. And yet here it was, vibrating through the wall, shaping itself with unnatural intimacy. He stumbled back, lantern quivering, his face pale. Clara, who had followed at a distance, caught the terror in his eyes before he masked it with a facade of clinical calm. But she knew. She whispered, "It knows you now." From that moment, Greaves could not escape the weight of being chosen. The wall no longer bled merely at random. It seemed to wait for his presence, its stains spreading wider, darker, when he entered the chapel. He began to feel watched, not by the sisters nor the villagers, but by the stones themselves. His journal shifted in tone from analysis to confession. "It calls to me," he scrawled in ink. "I should resist, but the compulsion to understand is unbearable." Determined to investigate, Greaves persuaded Clara to show him hidden parts of the convent, corridors long disused. Together they descended narrow staircases choked with dust, their lanterns illuminating carved arches where prayers had once been etched. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became, thick with a dampness that clung to skin. Finally, they reached a locked wooden door reinforced with rusted bands of iron. Clara hesitated, trembling. "We were told never to enter. It is where the first stains appeared." Greaves insisted. With effort, he pried it open. The hinges shrieked, a sound that echoed like a scream through the hollow corridors. Inside, they discovered a chamber beneath the chapel itself. The walls bore the same seepage, but here the stains were not random. They had been shaped. Crimson trails formed diagrams, circles interlocked with symbols that Greaves recognized faintly from forbidden texts. These were not natural formations. These were designs, deliberate and careful, drawn over years. In the center of the room lay a stone altar, its surface cracked, its edges worn. Upon it rested scraps of parchment brittle with age, their Latin text obscured by dark stains. Greaves picked one up, his hands trembling. The words, though fragmentary, spoke of binding, of sacrifice, of voices to be housed within stone so they may never walk among men again. Clara backed away, crossing herself furiously, her whisper trembling. "This is not prayer, this is prison." Greaves's mind raced. Was this convent founded not merely for worship, but as a seal, a structure meant to contain something unspeakable? Had the rituals of faith concealed rituals of another kind, darker and more ancient? He traced one of the diagrams with his lantern light, and for a moment he swore the lines pulsed, wet as if freshly drawn. His throat tightened. The walls here were not only bleeding, they were alive, sustained by centuries of whispered devotion and fear. As he turned, the door slammed shut behind them, plunging the chamber into suffocating dark. For a long moment, the only sound was Clara's shallow breathing, quick and sharp like a bird trapped in a cage. Dr. Greaves fumbled with his lantern, striking flint with trembling hands until a pale flame flickered to life. The chamber's symbols glowed red in the shifting light, as though painted not on the stone but within it, alive and seething beneath the surface. Greaves pressed against the heavy door, but it did not budge. The air thickened, filling his lungs with a damp, metallic taste. Clara whispered prayers, her voice quaking. Then from the altar came a noise, a dragging scrape as if nails clawed against stone from beneath. They froze. The parchment on the altar quivered, though no draft stirred the room. One sheet slid toward the edge, falling soundlessly. Greaves bent to retrieve it, but Clara hissed for him not to touch. Ignoring her, he lifted the page and felt a sudden sting in his palm. A droplet of blood welled where the parchment had grazed his skin. The words blurred before his eyes. He blinked, steadying himself, and saw that the ink had begun to run. Letters warped into shapes, fluid and writhing, until a single phrase emerged in Latin: "Liberate us." Clara backed against the wall, her face pale. "It is not bound here for prayer," she whispered. It begs release." Greaves's heart pounded. Was the convent truly a prison, its foundations built to cage something unspeakable? If so, who had constructed it? The early sisters, or those who had come before, cloaking darker rites beneath the veil of devotion? His thoughts raced, but he dared not voice them. Above, faintly, came the toll of the convent bell. 3 measured strikes, yet neither of them had pulled the rope. Clara's eyes widened. They know we are here. When finally the door creaked open, it was not by their strength. Sister Agnes stood in the threshold, her face ghostly in the lantern glow. She looked at the altar, at the symbols, at the parchment in Greaves's hand, and her expression hardened. "You were never meant to see this," she said. "It was sealed for a reason." Greaves demanded an explanation, his voice sharp, but Agnes offered none. She only gestured for Clara to leave, her gaze never leaving him. The young novice fled into the corridor, but Greaves lingered, his hand trembling as he held the blood-stained parchment. "What is it you keep here?" he pressed. Agnes's lips thinned. "Not keep, contain." Her answer was the closest to truth he had yet received, but she would say no more. She forced him back into the corridor, the heavy door slamming shut behind them. Greaves felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing through the stone as they ascended. He clutched the parchment beneath his coat, though Agnes's glare warned him she knew. That night, the sisters barred the chapel doors, but even with the wood bolted, the walls bled freely, trails spreading across the floor as if seeking escape. And in the silence that followed, Greaves heard it again. The voice, low and insistent, whispering his name. Dr. Greaves pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound did not cease. It throbbed inside his skull, each syllable carrying the weight of recognition, as though the walls themselves had learned him, claimed him. Clara found him in the corridor, his face gray, sweat streaking his brow. She grasped his arm, whispering urgently, "You must not answer it. That is how it takes you." But the temptation was unbearable. The rational mind clung to silence, yet something deeper yearned to respond, to acknowledge. Each whisper was a thread, pulling him closer to the stone. He retreated into his chamber, bolting the door, but still the voice seeped through mortar and wood alike. He filled his notebook with frantic scrawl, words overlapping in his haste. "Not external. It is inside the stone, inside us." The sisters grew restless. Meals were abandoned, prayers cut short. Their silence, once sacred, was now fractured by sudden outbursts. Cries in the night, whispered arguments behind closed doors. Clara told him they had lost 2 more novices in the early years, girls who had withered away after weeks of murmuring against the walls. Their names were never spoken again. "It chooses," she said, "and once chosen, there is no undoing." The villagers' unease reached fury. They gathered at the convent gates with torches, demanding answers, threatening fire. Rumors spread that the sisters harbored devils, that the bleeding walls were signs of blasphemy. A priest sent from Chicago attempted to bless the grounds, but his voice faltered mid-prayer, his face draining of color as the bell above the chapel tolled without touch. He fled before nightfall, refusing to return. Greaves tried to maintain control, but his thoughts splintered. He caught himself speaking aloud, asking questions into empty corridors. Once, in the chapel, he whispered, "What do you want?" And for a moment, he swore the stains on the wall shifted, widening like cracks in dry earth. Clara confronted him after. "You cannot treat it like a patient. It listens. And once it listens, it answers." Her fear struck him harder than her words. She was not naive, nor hysterical. She had endured long enough to know. Yet despite her warnings, he felt bound to the mystery. The parchment he had taken burned against his chest like a hidden sin, its words, "Liberate us," etched into his thoughts. That night, he awoke to the sound of movement in the hallway. Rising, he followed faint footsteps until he reached the novices' dormitory. The door creaked open, revealing Clara standing at the center of the room, her eyes wide, her hands pressed against the walls. "It says it knows you," she whispered. "It says it wants more than your name." Her voice broke, tears running down her face. "It wants the rest of us." Greaves felt a chill coil around his spine. He understood then that the entity had grown bolder, its hunger no longer confined to whispers or stains. It was reaching, claiming not only him, but all who dwelt within. And as the wind howled outside, carrying the distant shouts of villagers readying themselves with fire, the convent walls answered with a groan so deep it rattled the earth. Beneath their feet, dust rained down from the rafters, cloaking the novices in a gray haze. Some screamed, others fell. "You doubt fear, you are already halfway theirs." But before he could reply, the walls shuddered again, stronger this time, and the floor beneath them cracked with a sound like bone splitting. The sisters screamed. Outside, the mob roared, and through it all came a single word, echoing from every wall, every stone, every drop of bleeding mortar. "Walter!" The sound of his own name, spoken by stone, hollowed out Dr. Greaves like a blade to the marrow. It did not echo. It resonated, sinking into him as if the walls themselves had crawled beneath his skin. Clara staggered back, pressing her hands over her ears, though the voice was not heard in air. It vibrated within the bones. For a moment, Walter Greaves stood motionless, transfixed by the impossible recognition. The voice knew him now, no longer an observer, but the chosen subject of its attention. His medical training, his insistence on rational explanation, crumbled in that instant. He was prey, and worse, he felt himself willing to listen. The sisters wailed in the chapel as the stones bled freely, crimson rivulets pooling across the altar steps. Outside, the mob hammered against the convent gates, their chants rising with anger and fear. Greaves turned in circles, caught between forces human and inhuman, both pressing against the fragile barrier of stone. Agnes seized his arm, her grip iron. "It has marked you," she hissed. "That is how it begins. It will hollow you as it did the others." He tore his arm free, his voice shaking. "Then tell me the truth. Tell me what this place was built for, or I swear I will open that chamber again." For the first time, Agnes faltered. Lines of grief cut deep across her face as she whispered, "It was never meant to be a convent. The walls were raised as chains, not sanctuary. We were sent to keep it bound, not to worship in peace." The confession struck him like thunder, all his suspicions confirmed, yet the truth heavier than he imagined. The convent was no holy refuge. It was a prison disguised in devotion, and the guards had been the sisters themselves, condemned to silence not by choice, but by duty. Clara trembled, her voice breaking. "And now it wants to trade one prison for another. It wants you." The thought rooted itself in Greaves's mind. Every whisper, every pulse in the stone had grown more deliberate since his arrival. Was it coincidence, or had the entity reached for him the moment he entered its walls? He recalled the parchment's plea, "Liberate us," and shuddered. Perhaps liberation meant not freedom for it, but bondage for him. That night, sleep eluded him. He paced the narrow halls, haunted by his own name echoing against the bleeding stone. In exhaustion, he pressed his ear once more against the chapel wall, desperate for clarity. The voice returned, softer now, almost tender. It spoke in fragments, promises of knowledge beyond flesh, of truths unrecorded by any scripture. It whispered that, through him, it could finally live again. Walter recoiled, yet part of him leaned in. He thought of his notebooks filled with unanswered questions, of a lifetime spent chasing mysteries only half seen. To be chosen was terrifying, but it was also intoxicating. As dawn neared, he realized the walls had ceased bleeding. They waited, expectant, as though holding their breath for his reply. The sisters avoided his gaze, Clara's face pale with dread. And when he finally closed his eyes, he felt it not in stone, but in himself. The faint, steady rhythm of a second heartbeat. Dr. Greaves pressed his hand against his chest, certain he was imagining it. Yet the rhythm persisted, quiet but undeniable, layered beneath his own pulse. He sat at the edge of his narrow bed, drenched in sweat, staring at the gray dawn light spilling across the convent floor. His rational mind demanded explanation, fatigue, stress, an auditory hallucination echoing from within. But his body knew otherwise. The presence was no longer confined to the walls. It was inside him. When Clara came to bring water, she stopped short, her gaze fixed on him. He realized then that she must have seen something change. His skin was pale, almost translucent, veins rising faintly against the surface as though pressed by something within. She whispered his name, not in recognition but in fear. He tried to reassure her, but the words faltered. His voice trembled with an undertone that was not his own. Clara recoiled, backing into the doorway. "It's using you," she said, "just as it used them before. Them, the unspoken ones, the novices lost, the sisters who had faded, consumed by silence." He felt his stomach churn. Was this his fate, to dissolve until nothing remained but the voice, or worse, to become its vessel? That evening the villagers broke through the gates. Their torches flared against the convent walls, their shouts a chorus of fury. Greaves ran into the courtyard, arms outstretched, trying to hold them back. "If you burn it," he shouted, "you release what is bound." But they did not listen. To them, he was mad, another victim of the bleeding convent. Stones clattered through the air, striking the chapel doors. The sisters clustered together, praying aloud for the first time in years, their voices a fragile shield. Sister Agnes glared at Greaves, her voice cutting through the chaos. "If it has chosen you, then you must take it with you. Better one man lost than all of us damned." Her words froze him. Was sacrifice the only answer? To draw the entity fully into himself, to carry it away from the convent, leaving the sisters free? His mind rebelled, but the second heartbeat within him pulsed stronger, as if eager, waiting for consent. Clara seized his arm, tears streaking her face. "Don't listen to her. You can fight it. Don't give yourself to it." Yet even as she pleaded, her eyes betrayed doubt. The walls groaned again, louder, splitting, mortar bleeding freely. A fissure tore across the chapel facade, crimson seeping as though from a wound in living flesh. The mob screamed in terror, some fleeing, others raising torches higher. Greaves fell to his knees, clutching his chest. The second heartbeat thundered now, drowning his own. He felt words forming on his lips, not his thoughts, but something older, vast, pressing to speak through him. And as Clara screamed his name, his mouth opened, but the voice that emerged was not his. It poured from Walter Greaves like a river breaking through a dam, deep, resonant, layered with tones that no human throat could shape. The villagers froze in terror, torches shaking in their hands. The sisters pressed against one another, their prayers collapsing into cries. Clara, the closest to him, stumbled back as though struck, her eyes fixed on his face. His mouth moved, but his eyes no longer belonged to him. They glowed faintly, a reflection of something vast burning behind them. The words spilled in Latin and something older still, phrases that made the chapel stones shudder in response. Each syllable pressed into the air like a command, and the walls bled harder, crimson streams flooding the steps. For a moment the mob outside broke into chaos, convinced the convent itself was rising against them. Some fled into the fields, abandoning fire and weapon alike. Others, maddened with fear, pressed closer, determined to end the spectacle in flames. But the walls groaned, splitting further, and one villager was thrown to the ground by an unseen force. His body dragged across the dirt towards the convent gate. The crowd screamed. Sister Agnes fell to her knees before Walter, her eyes wide, not with reverence, but with resignation. "It has him," she whispered hoarsely. "We cannot save him now." Yet Clara refused to surrender. She rushed forward, seizing his shoulders, shouting his name again and again. For a heartbeat, his eyes flickered, human recognition surfacing, but the voice thundered louder, drowning her out. Greaves's own consciousness recoiled deep inside. A prisoner within his own body, he felt the entity surging through him, weaving into his blood, his breath, his heartbeat. So this is how they were hollowed, he thought. Not devoured in an instant, but worn down until self and other became indistinguishable. The second pulse in his chest was no longer faint, it was dominant. The sisters dragged Clara back, but she fought them, screaming, "He can fight it! He's not gone yet!" Her cries echoed above the mob's panic, above the shuddering walls. But Greaves's body no longer moved with his own will. His hands rose, trembling, and the stone behind him split wider as though awaiting him. The parchment he had hidden beneath his coat slipped free, carried by the draft of the breaking wall. It fluttered across the floor, its words illuminated by torchlight. "Liberate us." The phrase twisted itself across the page, letters warping as though alive. Clara saw it and understood. The choice had never been freedom versus containment. It was transfer. Walter Greaves staggered forward, his body pulled by invisible cords toward the altar. Each step he fought, but each step landed against his will. The villagers surged again, driven by terror, throwing their torches onto the convent roof. Flames licked upward, sparks raining into the night. As the fire spread, Walter's voice shifted, becoming two voices, then three, then many. A chorus spoke through him, echoing inhuman promises, reverberating in the marrow of all who listened. Clara screamed once more, reaching for him, but the sisters held her back, and with one final step, Walter Greaves stood before the bleeding wall, his hands pressed flat against its surface as if it were a mirror. The wall pulsed beneath Walter's palms, warm and damp, as though it possessed flesh and veins of its own. Blood seeped outward in slow waves, curling between his fingers, yet instead of recoiling, his body leaned closer, compelled. His reflection formed on the wet stone, not the man he knew, but a hollowed figure, its eyes black voids, its mouth stretched in a grimace of hunger. The villagers' fire crackled overhead, the convent roof alight. Smoke billowed down into the chapel, mixing with the metallic stench. The sisters coughed and clung to each other, torn between escape and duty. Clara broke free from their grasp, rushing toward Walter. She seized his arm, tugging, begging, "You're still there. Fight it, please." For a fleeting instant, his head turned. His true eyes flickered through, wet with desperate humanity. His lips parted as if to speak, but then the other voice surged, drowning him, twisting his mouth into a cruel smile. The wall exhaled, and Clara was thrown backward by a force that never touched her. She crashed into the pews, wind knocked from her lungs, but her gaze never left him. Sister Agnes stood rigid near the altar steps, her rosary clutched so tight blood trickled from her palm. "It cannot be destroyed," she cried over the roar of fire and mob. "It only moves from vessel to vessel. That is what the founders knew. That is what we were sworn to contain." Her words cut through Clara like a blade. This was never salvation, never protection, only postponement, a cycle of binding and release. Walter Greaves had not stumbled into mystery. He had been chosen by it. The walls were not merely prison but passage, seeking always another to carry their burden. The novices screamed as the chapel split with a sound like thunder. The wall against which Walter pressed now bulged outward, slick with blood, as though straining to be born into the world. His body shook violently, his voice fracturing into countless tones. From the fissure behind him came a whisper like wind through crypts. "Take him, and the chains are broken." Clara rose to her feet, her chest aching with every breath. She could not bear to let him vanish into the stone. She sprinted forward once more, even as the heat of flames licked across the rafters. She grasped Walter's face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You are stronger than it. You are more than it." For the briefest second, she thought she saw recognition. his eyes clearing, his jaw trembling, but the wall screamed, a sound beyond human, and blood poured in sheets across the altar. The sisters collapsed, covering their ears, their prayers lost in terror. And then Walter's body jerked, torn backward into the stone as though the surface were water. His reflection lingered, his mouth forming words no sound carried. The second heartbeat inside him thundered once, twice, then silence. Clara fell to her knees, sobbing. The wall sealed itself smooth, the blood receding, leaving nothing but unbroken stone. The fire roared above, villagers shouted, and the sisters wept. But Walter Greaves was gone. The words rippled through the convent like a funeral bell. Clara's cry echoed against the scorched rafters, raw with grief. The sisters huddled together, their prayers faltering into silence as they stared at the unbroken wall where he had stood only moments before. Outside, the villagers pressed closer, their torches flaring against the smoke-thick night, demanding proof that the evil within had ended. But nothing had ended. Nothing ever ended here. The fire consumed the upper beams, raining sparks into the chapel, yet the stone walls refused to crack. The building stood as though defying destruction, bleeding still in narrow rivulets that glistened against firelight. Clara rose shakily to her feet, her face streaked with soot and tears. She pressed her hand to the wall, searching for warmth, for pulse, for any trace of him. But the stone was cold, indifferent. Sister Agnes placed a hand on her shoulder. Her voice trembled, stripped of all severity. He is part of it now. The binding holds, for a time. Clara turned, fury burning in her eyes. You speak as though it is mercy, but it has stolen him, as it has stolen others. How many before him, how many after? Agnes could not answer. Her silence was the only truth. The convent had always been a cycle of sacrifice, and Walter Greaves had simply been the latest vessel chosen. By dawn, the villagers had retreated, shaken by what they witnessed yet unconvinced. Some swore they saw faces in the fire's smoke, his face among them, staring back with hollow eyes. Others claimed the walls themselves whispered as the flames licked them, begging for release. Fear spread through the countryside, and though the fire scarred the convent's roof, the stone stood firm, as if it had swallowed the flames whole. In the weeks that followed, the sisters resumed their routines, but the silence was no longer sacred. It was oppressive, broken only by the faintest sounds, soft taps within the walls, like distant heartbeats. Clara lingered each night in the chapel, her prayers turning not to God, but to Walter, begging that some fragment of him still endured. Sometimes when the lanterns burned low, she swore she heard her name carried through the stone, faint and urgent. She never told the others. Records show the convent was eventually abandoned, its doors sealed, its grounds avoided by all who lived nearby. But even decades later, travelers claim to hear chanting within, or to see blood trailing down the stones under the moonlight. Some insisted that when they pressed their ears to the wall, a voice whispered back, not in Latin, not in prayer, but in the trembling tones of a man's voice. They said it spoke the words of a doctor long lost, warning them not to listen. Others said it begged to be freed, and some, though they never admitted it aloud, confessed that when they leaned too close, they felt their own names spoken back to them. Perhaps Walter Greaves was gone, or perhaps he remained, woven into the endless heartbeat of the bleeding convent, waiting still for someone to answer.